In the spring of 1969, a farm equipment dealer named Frank Rusch drove out to Merle Haskins' farm in Benton County, Iowa, with a new large green tractor on a flatbed and a deal sheet in his hand. Merle was 43 years old. He had been farming 320 Benton County acres since 1958, when he had bought out his father's share of the operation on a 3-year land contract that had been paid off by 1961. He had one primary tractor, a 1955 vintage large row crop machine he had bought used in 1959 for $1,100 and had maintained with the specific attention of a man who planned to keep a machine for a long time. Frank had looked at the 1955 machine in the equipment yard before he came inside. He had looked at it the way a dealer looks at a trade-in, assessing what the lot would take it for, what reconditioning it would need, what the comparable used market would bear. He had come inside with a number in mind. He had said, "Merle, I can do $400 on that machine toward the new one." Merle had said, $400. Frank had said, "It's a 14-year-old tractor, Merle. Good rubber, runs well, but the market for used equipment that old is limited. I'd have to put work into it before I could put it on the lot, and even then I'd be fighting the age." Merle had said, "What year is the one you're selling?" Frank had said, "Brand new, this year's model." Merle had said, "What's the price?" Frank had said the number. He had laid out the deal, $400 on trade, the remainder financed at the prevailing rate over 4 years. Merle had looked at the deal sheet. He had looked at the 4-year payment schedule. He had looked at the total cost when the interest was added. He had said, "I'll think about it." Frank had said, "Merle, these machines are moving. I've got 2 other farms interested in the same configuration." Merle had said, "Then sell it to one of them." He had not said this with hostility. He had said it with the specific calm of a man who had already decided. Frank had taken the deal sheet back. He had said, "The offer on your trade is good through the end of the month if you change your mind." Merle had said, "I appreciate that, Frank." He had walked Frank to his truck. He had watched the flatbed drive away with the new machine still on it. He had gone back to the shop and done the valve adjustment he had been planning before Frank's visit had interrupted the afternoon. The 1955 tractor was in the equipment yard when Frank left. It was in the equipment yard the following spring and the spring after that. It was in the equipment yard through the entire period when Frank Rusch's dealership was doing well and the new machines were moving, and Merle Haskins was the farmer in Benton County who was still running the 1955 machine. The dealership that Frank Rusch had built, the franchise he had taken over from his father in 1961, and had run through the 1960s and 1970s expansion years, had been sold when Frank retired in 1988. The new owner had operated it through the late 1980s and into the 1990s with variable results. The franchise had changed brands in 1993. It had closed in 1995. In 2001, a man named Carl Westover drove from his home in Illinois to Merle Haskins's farm in Benton County, Iowa, looked at the 1955 machine that Frank Rusch had offered $400 for in 1969, and paid $3,800 for it. Carl was a collector of working condition vintage farm equipment. He had found the machine through a farm equipment broker who had found it through the Benton County Agricultural Network, where Merle's 1955 machine had been known for years as an example of a specific model in exceptional original condition, with documented single-family ownership and a verifiable maintenance history. Carl had paid $3,800, 9.5 times the $400 Frank Rusch had offered 32 years earlier. He had loaded the machine on a trailer and taken it to Illinois. Frank Rusch's dealership had been closed for 6 years by then. Let me tell you about the 32 years between Frank's visit and Carl's check, because the 32 years are the argument and they deserve their specific account. Merle had kept the 1955 machine as his primary secondary tractor after 1969, not his primary machine, which by the mid-1960s had been a different and larger machine he had also bought, used, and maintained himself. The 1955 machine did the work that did not require the largest machine's power: light field work, running implements in the yard, the utility tasks that a well-maintained mid-size machine handles more efficiently than an oversized one that burns fuel doing work it is larger than required for. He had done 2 significant rebuilds on it across the 32 years. The first rebuild in the winter of 1971 to 1972, not because the machine had failed, because the compression check showed it was ready for attention after approximately 9,000 hours, and Merle had decided to address it in the winter before it addressed itself in the field. He had pulled the engine, bored the cylinders, fitted new pistons and rings, replaced the bearings, done the valve job. He had put the engine back together and started it in February of 1972. It ran clean. The rebuild had cost $247 in parts and machine shop work. The second rebuild in the winter of 1982 to 1983. Same process, same decision process: compression check, assessment, decision to rebuild on his schedule rather than the engines. The bores had room for the second overbore. The block was sound. The crank was within specification. He had done the work through December and January. He had started the engine in February 1983 and driven it into the field that spring. Total parts cost $389. 2 rebuilds. Total rebuild cost $636. Total investment in the machine from 1959, purchased through the 1983 rebuild, $1,100 purchase price, plus $636 in rebuild costs, plus oil and filters and maintenance consumables across 24 years, approximately $1,900 all in. He had then run the machine for 18 more years on the second rebuild, from 1983 to 2001, before selling it to Carl. No additional significant expenditure. Maintenance costs across those 18 years, approximately $70 per year in consumables. Total maintenance after the second rebuild, approximately $1,260. Total lifetime investment from 1959 purchase to 2001 sale, approximately $3,160. Sale price in 2001, $3,800. The machine had more than paid for its lifetime operating costs. He had run it for 42 years through 2 rebuilds and 32,000 estimated hours of service, and had sold it for more than the sum of everything he had ever spent on it. Frank had offered $400 in 1969. Carl paid $3,800 in 2001. The dealer who offered $400 had been closed for 6 years by the time the collector paid $3,800. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer And tell me in the comments, have you ever been offered a price for something that turned out to be worth considerably more to the right buyer? Let me tell you about the almost quit moment, because Merle had one, and it happened not in 1969, when Frank made the offer, but in 1987, the year a different dealer made a different offer. In 1987, a dealer from Benton, a different franchise, a different man. Frank's dealership still nominally operating under Frank's ownership, but heading toward its 1988 sale, had come to Merle's farm about a trade on his primary machine. During the conversation, the dealer had looked at the 1955 machine in the shed and had said, "Merle, what are you going to do with that old thing? I might be able to find you a buyer." He had said, "It's not worth much as a machine, but there's some collector interest in that model starting to develop. I can probably get you $600, maybe $700 if the timing's right." Merle had said, "I'll keep it." The dealer had said, "It's been sitting in that shed for a while." Merle had said, "It runs. I used it last week." The dealer had shrugged and moved on to the primary machine discussion. But Merle had thought about the $600 to $700 offer for a week afterward. By 1987, the collector market for vintage farm equipment was in its early stages, not the developed market it would become in the 1990s and 2000s, but beginning to develop. The dealer's assessment of collector interest was not wrong. The $600 to $700 offer was probably close to fair market value in 1987. Merle had sat with the question for a week. He had not been keeping the machine specifically for its collector value. He had been keeping it because it ran and did work, and he had not found a reason to get rid of it, and he had a general reluctance to part with machines that ran. But the collector angle had made him think about it more explicitly. He had concluded, not yet. He had not been able to articulate precisely why not yet rather than yes. He had decided on the basis of a feeling that the machine's time had not come. Not the time to sell, and not because of a calculation about future value, but because a machine that runs and does work does not need to be sold until it stops running or stops doing work or the right buyer appears. The right buyer had not appeared yet in 1987. The right buyer had appeared in 2001. Carl Westover had been the right buyer. He had come looking specifically for a working condition example of that model with documentation in the specific condition that Merle's maintenance history had produced. He had not been willing to pay $700. He had been willing to pay $3,800. Merle had held the machine for 14 more years after the 1987 almost quit. In 1987, 14 more years of holding the machine had looked like keeping a shed ornament that might bring $700. In 2001, it had looked like a $3,800 transaction with a collector who had driven from Illinois specifically for this machine. He had not known in 1987 that the collector market would develop the way it had developed by 2001. He had not been making a calculated bet on the collector market's trajectory. He had been responding to a feeling that the machine's time had not come. In the same way, he had been responding to a feeling in 1969 when Frank Rusch had said $400 and Merle had said, "I'll think about it," and had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds before concluding, "No." Let me tell you about Carl Westover and what Carl said about the machine, because Carl's assessment of the machine is the closing argument, and it is more precise than anything Merle or Frank would have said about it. Carl had arrived at the farm on a Saturday morning in late May of 2001. He had come with a trailer and a checkbook and 30 years of experience buying vintage farm equipment from farm families across the Midwest. He had looked at the machine for approximately 2 hours before he said anything about price. He had started the engine, it had started on the second crank, and listened to it idle. He had checked the oil, the coolant, the hydraulics. He had looked at the sheet metal, which showed the specific patina of a machine that had been used in the field and cleaned regularly, rather than a machine that had been stored and neglected. He had looked at the hour meter, which had been replaced at some point and did not reflect the full service history, and had accepted Merle's documentation in the maintenance log as the relevant history. The maintenance log was a composition book that Merle had started in 1959 and had maintained through 42 years of ownership. Every oil change, every valve adjustment, every significant service event, every repair. The 2 rebuild winters documented in detail, parts ordered, costs, the date of the first post-rebuild start, the post-rebuild compression readings. Carl had read the log carefully. He had been quiet for a long time after reading it. He had said, "Merle, this is the most complete maintenance record I've seen on a machine this age." Merle had said, "I kept it because my father kept records on his equipment, and I got the habit." Carl had said, "It's worth money." He had paused. Not to most buyers, to the buyers who care about this model and this era, a complete 42-year maintenance record on a single-owner machine is significant. He had offered $3,800. Merle had said yes without negotiating. He had known the machine was worth more than the last offer he had received in 1987, and he had not known precisely what it was worth in the current market. And $3,800 was a number that felt right against what he knew of the machine's history and condition. Carl had written the check. He had loaded the machine. He had shaken Merle's hand and had driven to Illinois. The maintenance log had gone with the machine. Merle had kept a photocopy, not because he had planned to, but because his daughter had suggested making one before Carl came, and he had done it, and he had been glad to have it afterward. The photocopy is in the filing cabinet in the farmhouse. It is 42 years of one man's handwriting recording what he had done to one machine across the whole of his farming career. The machine is in Illinois. The record is in Benton County. Let me tell you one final thing, which is what Merle said when I asked him whether he had been satisfied with $3,800 for a machine he had kept for 42 years. He had been 75 years old, sitting in the kitchen of the same farmhouse he had been farming from since 1958. He had retired from active farming in 1998, and his son had taken over the ground. The filing cabinet with the photocopy was in the room with us. He had said, $3,800 was more than I expected to get. I had said, Frank offered you $400 in 1969. He had smiled. He had said, Frank was right about $400. He had paused. That was what Frank could do with it. Put it on the lot, move it fast, maybe make a little on the margin. He paused. That was not what Carl could do with it. He had said Frank was pricing what he could do. Carl was pricing what the machine was. I had said, and what was the machine? He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, It was a 1955 machine with a complete maintenance record and 42 years of single-owner documented service and 2 clean rebuilds and original sheet metal and an engine that started on the second crank. He paused. There aren't many of those left. He paused. Carl knew where every one of them was. He had said, Frank didn't know what Carl knew. He paused. I didn't know what Carl knew either when it comes to that. He had looked at the filing cabinet. He had said, but I kept the log. And the log was what Carl came for as much as the machine. Frank was pricing what he could do. Carl was pricing what the machine was. These are 2 different prices for 2 different relationships to the same object. Merle had kept the machine past Frank's price and into Carl's price without knowing precisely what he was doing. He had kept it because it ran and did work, and the right time to sell had not come. The right time had come in 2001 with a check and a trailer from Illinois, $400 in 1969, $3,800 in 2001. The dealership closed for 6 years when the check was written. The machine is in Illinois at summer shows. The log is in Benton County in the filing cabinet. Merle said, I kept the log. The log was what Carl came for as much as the machine. Subscribed to the honest farmer. Hit the bell. Frank was pricing what he could do. Carl was pricing what the machine was. Said once, never said better. Let me tell you about the maintenance log in specific terms, because the log is what differentiated this machine from every other 1955 vintage machine available to a collector in 2001, and Carl's willingness to pay $3,800 rather than $700 was directly attributable to the log rather than to the machine alone. The composition book had been started on a Thursday in August of 1959, the week after Merle had bought the machine and brought it home. The first entry was in Merle's handwriting, which in 1959 was the neat, careful penmanship of a man who had learned to write well in school and had not yet accumulated the slight looseness that comes from 40 years of farm paperwork. The entry read, August 14th, 1959. Machine purchased, inspected all systems, oil change. Valve clearances checked and adjusted. Intake 0.013, exhaust 0.016, all within spec. Air cleaner serviced. Fuel system checked. First oil change scheduled at 100 hours. The log had an entry for every 100-hour oil change through 42 years of operation. In the early years, the entries had been detailed. Oil viscosity used, filter part number, observations about engine behavior. In the middle years, the entries had become more abbreviated: date, hours, oil changed, filter changed, notes if any. In the later years, as the machine did lighter work and fewer hours per season, the entries had spaced out and had become more observational. The specific sounds and behaviors and characteristics of an engine that Merle knew as well as he knew anything he owned. The 2 rebuild winters had the most extensive entries. Pages of notes from the teardown assessment, the parts ordered with part numbers and prices, the machine shop work with the shop name and invoice dates, the assembly notes, the first start observations, the break-in period records. Carl had read these rebuild pages with particular attention. He had been looking for specific information, whether the bores had been done correctly, confirmed by the overbore dimensions recorded and the part numbers on the oversized pistons, whether the valve job had been done to specification, confirmed by the post-rebuild clearance measurements recorded. whether the rebuilds had been done by someone who knew the engine, confirmed by the accuracy of every measurement and specification recorded against the service manual. The log had told Carl things about the engine's condition that no amount of external inspection could have told him. It told him that the first rebuild had been done at the correct interval, before the bore wear had become severe enough to require the maximum overbore. It told him that the second rebuild had been done correctly and with the right parts. It told him that the maintenance between rebuilds had been done on schedule and to specification. This information had a specific value to Carl. It told him what he was buying. He was not buying a vintage machine with an unknown history. He was buying a vintage machine with a known history that was documented and verifiable, stretching from 1959 to 2001. He was buying 42 years of a single man's careful attention to one specific machine, recorded in handwriting that went from neat and careful in 1959 to practiced and precise in 2001. No dealer in 1969 could have offered $400 for this. The log had not existed yet as a complete document. It was 12 years old in 1969, with 27 years still to be written. Frank Rusch had been offering for a machine. By 2001, Carl was offering for a machine and its complete documented history. The history had 42 years in it. It was worth more than the machine without it. Merle had said, "I kept the log." The log was what Carl came for as much as the machine. He was right. The log was the difference between $700 and $3,800. Let me tell you about the machines that Frank Rusch's dealership had sold during the years between 1969 and 1995, because the dealership's fate and the machine's fate run parallel, and the parallel is worth following. Frank had sold the new machine to a different farm in 1969. The configuration he had brought to Merle's farm had eventually gone to a neighboring operation in Benton County. The farm had run it for 7 years, maintained it adequately, but not particularly well, and had traded it in 1976 for the next upgrade. The 1969 machine had gone to the lot, been reconditioned, and sold to a smaller operation. It had changed hands twice more before its last known owner had scrapped it in the early 1990s when the hydraulic pump had failed and the repair cost had exceeded the machine's trade value. This is the path that new machines travel through the dealer cycle. They are bought, run, traded, reconditioned, sold, run, traded, reconditioned, sold again, until at some point in the cycle they are worth less than the cost of keeping them running, and they are scrapped or parted out. The 1955 machine had not traveled this path. It had been owned by one person from 1959 to 2001. It had been maintained by one person's standards and rebuilt by one person's judgment, and operated within one person's knowledge of its specific behavior and capacity. It had accumulated 42 years of single-owner care that the dealer cycle, by its nature, destroys, because the dealer cycle is based on replacing rather than maintaining, and replacing destroys the continuity of ownership and knowledge that is the thing the collector market pays for. Frank had offered $400 to break that continuity. If Merle had accepted, the 1955 machine would have entered the dealer cycle. It would have been reconditioned and sold, run by a buyer who did not know its history, traded at some point, reconditioned again until it had reached the end of the cycle, There would have been no log in a filing cabinet in Benton County. There would have been no Carl Westover from Illinois. There would have been $400 to Merle in 1969, and the machine would have been worth whatever it was worth to the dealer's cycle until it wasn't worth anything. Merle had declined the continuity break. He had kept the machine and the log and the 42 years of single-owner care that the log documented. Carl had found it in 2001 and had recognized what it was. Not a vintage machine, but a vintage machine with an intact history, and had paid accordingly. Frank had offered $400 for the machine. Carl had paid $3,800 for the machine and its history. The history was worth more than the machine. The continuity was worth more than the trade. Merle had kept the continuity without knowing precisely what it was worth. He had kept it because the machine ran, and the log was where he kept what he knew about it, and it had not been time to stop. The time had come in 2001. The right buyer had come with it. Let me tell you the last specific, because the last specific is the one that says the most. In the spring of 2002, the year after Carl had taken the machine to Illinois, Merle had driven past the building in Benton that had housed the equipment franchise Frank Rusch had sold in 1988. The building had been closed since 1995, 7 years. The parking lot where Frank had parked his demonstration equipment was empty. The building had been something else briefly, a storage facility, then nothing, and was now empty again. Merle had slowed down to look. He had thought about 1969, the flatbed with the new machine, the deal sheet, the $400 offer, the calm refusal. He had thought about 2001, Carl's trailer, Carl's check, the log going to Illinois with the machine. He had thought, Frank's building is empty and the machine is at summer shows in Illinois. He had not thought this with triumph. He had thought it with the specific interest of a man who has been proved right about something and is taking a moment to observe the proof before driving on. He had driven on. He had gone home. He had taken the photocopy of the maintenance log out of the filing cabinet and had looked at it for a few minutes. 42 years of handwriting. The neat penmanship of 1959 grown, practiced, and sure by 2001. The record of what he had done to one machine across the whole of his farming life. He had put it back in the filing cabinet. He had gone to lunch. Frank was pricing what he could do. Carl was pricing what the machine was. The machine is at summer shows in Illinois. The log is in the filing cabinet in Benton County. The building is empty. The $400 offer was what Frank could do. The $3,800 check was what Carl could see. Merle had kept the machine long enough for Carl to find it. That was the whole decision. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. $400 in 1969. $3,800 in 2001. The dealer had been closed for 6 years when the check was written. Keep what runs. Keep the log. The right buyer will find it.